welcome back to another episode of the most controversial sports channel on YouTube. Welcome back to Swivel Chair Sports. I'm your host, Zach Circlebark Burkle, here with the ghost today, Aaron. Go and say hi, Aaron.
Hi. If you like our content, be sure to like and subscribe, leave a comment, and let us know what you think.
Yep, we're creeping up on 100 subscribers, so your subscription means a lot, and thank you for watching. But other than that, let's go ahead and get into it. So in this video, we're going to be continuing our off-season grading series. So far, we've handed out grades to all the teams in both the AFC and NFC West divisions, as well as the AFC and NFC North divisions. And in our most recent video, we looked at the teams in the NFC South. But in this video, we'll be taking a look at the AFC South, which includes the Texans, Colts, Jaguars, and Titans. If you haven't seen our first few grading videos, we're going to be taking a look at the key departures, key free agencies, and trade additions, and notable 2024 draft picks before revealing our grades for each team in the division. Without further ado, starting off with the Houston Texans. Houston last season surpassed every expectation anybody had for them. In the first season with CJ Stroud and D'Amico Ryans manning the ship, as the Texans would go on to win the division and beat the Cleveland Browns in the wild card round of the playoffs before falling to the best team throughout the regular season in the Baltimore Ravens. This offseason, the Texans did not hesitate to take advantage of their window of contention, seemingly popping open, bringing in a slew of proven veteran talent. Starting off with the key departures, though, it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows for Houston, as they had to witness emerging star edge rusher Jonathan Grenard leaving free agency and sign with the Minnesota Vikings, who's coming off the best season of his career, along with linebacker Blake Cashman, who also moved on to Minnesota this offseason and got some recognition last season, winning a Defensive Player of the Week honors, and looked to have an outside chance of being in the DPOY race throughout the first half of the season. The Texans also parted ways with a couple of defensive talents they brought in last offseason, watching defensive lineman Sheldon Rankins sign with the Cincinnati Bengals and linebacker Denzel Perryman, who returns to the Chargers. As for the additions, the Texans brought in a plethora of talented veterans to surround this young Houston team, signing edge rusher Danielle Hunter away from Minnesota in what ended up essentially being a player swap for Jonathan Grenard in an attempt to bring in a slightly more experienced force off the end, as well as bringing in another veteran edge rusher in Danico Autry from Tennessee, who even in his mid-30s is coming off the best season of his career last year, and his Titans teammate linebacker Azeez Al-Shaair, who they hope can replace the production lost by Blake Cashman. But the Texans made massive splashes on the offensive side of the football too, first re-signing tight end Dalton Schultz to a 3-year deal to continue providing a safety blanket for young quarterback CJ Stroud, as well as bringing in an upgrade at the running back position in Joe Mixon through a trade with the Cincinnati Bengals, who can hopefully relieve some of the pressure on the passing game. The most notable addition, of course, was through the biggest trade potentially in this entire offseason so far, when the Texans were able to bring in wide receiver Stephon Diggs and a couple of late-round picks from the Bills for their 2025 second-round pick in a move that adds yet another weapon to an increasingly stacked arsenal down in Houston alongside Nico Collins and Tank Dell. Then looking into their draft, the Texans traded away their first-round pick, dealing it to Minnesota and bringing back second-round pick in this year and next year's drafts, before using that second-round pick this year to take cornerback Kamari Lassiter out of Georgia, who they hope can be the long-term answer at cornerback for them opposite Derek Stingley. Then with their own second-round pick, they were able to scoop up tackle out of Notre Dame Blake Fisher, who, even if he doesn't start right away, should develop into a really solid NFL lineman after a successful career for the Fighting Irish. The Texans also looked to further improve their secondary in the third round, taking safety Kalen Bullock out of USC, who is considered to be a bit of a project, but with a very high ceiling if he can solve his tackling issues at the NFL level. So, Aaron, what are your thoughts on the Texans offseason? Did they do everything they needed to do in order to take that next step?
They had a kind of tough offseason. They had some big losses. Greenard led the team in tackles for loss and sacks. Cashman led the team in tackles, was the leader of that defense. Perryman, fourth on the team in tackles. So they lost quite a lot of production there on defense, but then they added some some home runs there. Daniil Hunter, 16.5 sacks last season. Danico Autry, 11.5 sacks. So kind of replacing the production that they lost there. And let's not forget they still have Will Anderson, who had an okay rookie season. I'd probably look for him to make that step next season and really kind of progress. But then they also added, kind of like you said, Azeez Al-Shaair, 163 tackles. They also drafted Jamal Hill out of Oregon. So see if D'Amico Ryans can kind of put his stamp on that defense and make it notably better from what it was last year. And then kind of on the offensive side, obviously traded for Stephon Diggs and Joe Mixon. They were 22nd rush offense last year and with Devin Singletary. So I think Joe Mixon will have quite the impact for the Texans, being a slightly bigger and more physical back.
Yeah, and coming off, I believe, 1,000-yard season in Cincinnati last year, he should be able to continue that in a equally probably lethal offense with C.J. Stroud and that plethora of wide receiver talent they have on the outside. So, I like you said, they did lose a lot of production in Grenard and Cashman and Perriman, but the guys they brought in are no slouches either. If not, that you could maybe even look at them as slight upgrades for at least some of the positions. So I do think the Texans made the right moves to compensate for the guys they saw walk out the door. Maybe even bringing in more veteran talent on the outside with Daniil Hunter and Danico Autry, two veteran presences with double-digit sacks last season. And then Azeez Al-Shaair, who had over 160 tackles. So I think considering the guys they brought in to replace the losses, and then obviously the Diggs and Joe Mixon additions, I think I have to settle with an A grade for the Houston Texans. I think they really knocked it out of the park. They lost some big names, but the guys they brought in are equally, if not more talented than those pieces. So I think as far as, heading in the right direction, they took another huge step forward this offseason and could be right amongst the mix at the top of the AFC this year.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be remiss to forget to mention Christian Harris, who had a pick six against Joe Flacco in that playoff game. Really kind of came into his own last year at the linebacker position. So I think they're, despite their losses, are in good shape there. So I think I'm right there with you at an A.
Yeah, it was really
A plus. I'll give him an A plus.
Yeah.
I'll give him an A plus. Yeah.
First A plus of the season, and I think rightfully deserved because bringing in 28 sacks between Autry and Hunter, Shaair compensates for the Blake Cashman loss. So I think they did great this offseason. So moving on to the Indianapolis Colts. The expectations for the Colts in 2023 were lowered immediately following the injury to rookie quarterback Anthony Richardson. However, with backup quarterback Gardner Minshew stepping up in Richardson's stead, Indy was able to remain competitive enough to flirt with playoff contention, finishing tied with the Jaguars and one game out of the final wildcard spot. The Colts this offseason hope to build upon a fairly successful season, all things considered, last year. Starting off with the key losses Indy suffered through, the Colts were fortunate enough to bring back the majority of their impending free agents. All the Colts really lost this year was their backup quarterback, Gardner Minshew, who signed a deal with the Las Vegas Raiders after stepping in last season and almost leading the Colts to the playoffs in his 13 starts, as well as parting ways with backup running back Zach Moss, who signed with the Cincinnati Bengals. With lead back Jonathan Taylor signing an extension during the season last year, this doesn't seem like a major impactful loss either, despite Moss having a great few games filling in for Taylor last season. But looking at the key acquisitions this offseason, Indianapolis mainly looked to retain a lot of the talent they were at risk of losing, specifically on the defensive side of the football, signing star defensive tackle DeForest Buckner to a 2-year contract extension to remain the central part of the defensive line. Also re-signing defensive backs Julian Blackmon and Kenny Moore. Blackmon has improved every year of his young career so far after the Colts drafted him in the 3rd round back in 2020, while Moore came into the league as an undrafted free agent with the Patriots in the preseason before not making it through the final roster cuts in 2017, and the Colts took a flyer on him, developing him into a solid NFL caliber cornerback through the last 7 seasons. The most notable retention for Indy this offseason, however, had to be emerging star wide receiver Michael Pittman Jr., who the Colts signed to a brand new 3-year, $70 million deal. before the contracts of guys like Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jalen Waddle, and Justin Jefferson could impact the value Pittman may have been seeking this year. And as for the draft, Indianapolis looked to make the best of their position in the middle of the board, selecting edge rusher Laiatu Latu out of UCLA with the 15th overall pick. Latu was viewed by many as being one of the top edge rushers in the class this year. Despite an injury-riddled start to his collegiate career at Washington, he was able to turn things around at UCLA and stay healthy, where he became one of the most productive pass rushers in college during his 2-year stint in UCLA. After that, taking wide receiver Adonai Mitchell in the second round, with a lot of scouts and analysts projected to go late in the first round, so a good value pick there. He could potentially step into the number 2 wide receiver spot if Josh Downs and Alec Pierce struggle to grow in the NFL. Then going with a couple offensive linemen in the 3rd and 4th rounds, taking Matt Goncalves out of Pitt and center Tanner Bortolini out of Wisconsin to hopefully develop into quality protection around their young quarterback. And finally going a ton of defense in day 3 of the draft, taking 3 defensive backs in the 5th and 6th rounds. In safeties, Jalen Carlisle and Jalen Simpson from Missouri and Auburn, respectively, and cornerback Micah Abraham out of Marshall. With all that being said, what do you think of the Colts offseason, Aaron?
They didn't really do a whole lot. You know, they lost Zach Moss, who was, good while Jonathan Taylor was having his contract dispute. Lost Gardner Minshew, who obviously played most of the season with Anthony Richardson being hurt. But then they brought in Joe Flacco, and that's really the only player of significance that they brought in that wasn't already on the team. I mean, they re-signed a lot of players that they already had on the team.
Yeah.
So, and then the draft, kind of like you said, Latu, good pick. Adonai Mitchell, good pick. From then on, it's just kind of, who's able to develop.
Right.
But, not really doing a whole lot as far as going and getting some proven veteran players. So I think it's kind of the waiting game. They were, good last year, kind of probably hampered a little bit by their quarterback play. So hopefully Anthony Richardson is there and able to develop this year. They do have a pretty good receiver core, so I don't know. It's just they're kind of one of those teams like you're gonna have to wait and see. They're kind of tough to judge right now.
Yeah, it's on paper, it doesn't really feel like they did a whole lot, like you said, mainly just bringing back the guys that they were at risk of losing. I mean, obviously signing guys like DeForest Buckner and Michael Pittman to those extensions, those multiple-year extensions, was a big deal, so I want to give them credit for that. Bringing back a couple defensive backs that you've been able to develop into quality players, and Julian Blackmon and Kenny Moore, also like that, but yeah, they didn't really bring in a whole lot of proven veteran talent, like you said, from the outside, and maybe you kind of wish they would have done that specifically on the defensive side of the football. I guess I'm going to give them a C+, just because I think they could have improved the defense more, and I don't know, they didn't really do a whole lot. Like you said, they re-signed most of the players, which was good, but probably could have looked to bring in some defensive talent.
Yeah, I probably would have liked to see a linebacker in there somewhere. But they did go B tackle late, Jonah Lalu out of Oklahoma. So I guess they're trying, but I would have loved to see, granted this draft wasn't super deep on linebackers, so I guess they were kind of hampered there, but yeah, I think if they're good next year, it's because of largely what they already had, I believe.
Right.
So yeah, I'd probably lean purely because of the Latu and Adonai Mitchell's pick. I'll give them a B-.
Moving on to the Jacksonville Jaguars. The Jaguars enjoyed a roller coaster of a season once again, as the injuries to Trevor Lawrence began to add up towards the end of the season. Losing 5 of their last 6 games after Lawrence suffered a high ankle sprain, they tried to play through in an attempt to sneak into the playoffs. This offseason, the Jags were looking to get back on track and bring in some more talent to complement and take pressure off Trevor Lawrence. Starting out with the key departures for Jacksonville, the Jags lost two of their top receivers on the depth chart, with Calvin Ridley joining the division rival Tennessee Titans, and Zay Jones being released and signing with the Arizona Cardinals. Other than those losses, Jacksonville did also part ways with some defensive talent, but with their defense being fairly underwhelming the last few seasons, they were ready to move on from the likes of Clavon Chason and Dwayne Smoot, two edge rushers that haven't developed into what the Jags were hoping for when they selected them within the first 3 rounds of their respective drafts. As for the key additions in Duval County this year, first bit of business was bringing back a couple notable names in edge rusher Josh Allen and offensive lineman Ezra Cleveland. Josh Allen, not the quarterback, is one of the top pass rushers in the entire NFL and clearly atop the Jaguars' list of priorities this offseason after recording 17.5 sacks in 2023 alone at the age of 26. Ezra Cleveland, on the other hand, was brought in by Jacksonville halfway through the season last year in a trade with the Vikings that saw the Jags only having to give up a 2024 6th-round pick. Cleveland showed he was more than worth the investment and earned a shiny new 3-year deal from Jacksonville. Hoping to add some more veteran leadership to the offensive line this year, the Jags also brought in center Mitch Morse from the Buffalo Bills. Right around the same time, they snagged his Bills teammate, wide receiver Gabe Davis, to come in and replace the production they saw walk out the door by losing Calvin Ridley. They then brought in another wide receiver through free agency as well in Devin Duvernay from the Baltimore Ravens, who's had more success as a return specialist than a receiver since entering the league in 2020, with about 71% of his career all-purpose yards coming on punt or kick returns. And in an attempt to turn around what was a bottom 10 group in terms of passing yards allowed last season, the Jags brought in free agent safety Darnell Savage, who missed 7 games last year for the Green Bay Packers, and journeyman cornerback Ronald Darby, who joins his 5th team in 6 seasons after helping the Eagles win a Super Bowl back in 2018. As for the draft, Jacksonville was the beneficiary of the wide receiver drought we witnessed after Rome Odunze was taken at 9, getting to draft LSU wide receiver Brian Thomas Jr., 23rd overall, who could develop into a premier target for Trevor Lawrence to throw to alongside Christian Kirk and newly acquired Gabe Davis. In an attempt to bring the Bayou to Duval, the Jags also brought in a couple of Thomas Jr.'s teammates from LSU on the defensive side of the football, selecting defensive lineman Mason Smith and Jordan Jefferson in the 2nd and 4th rounds respectively. And they also added some depth to the cornerback room by drafting Jerrion Jones out of Florida State in the 3rd round and DeAndre Prince out of Ole Miss in the 5th round. And as a Missouri fan, I can't forget to mention the addition of tackle Javon Foster in the 4th as well out of Mizzou. So Aaron, what are your feelings on the Jaguars offseason? Did they keep pace with the rest of the division this year?
I don't know about kept pace. I mean, I think it's probably almost impossible to keep pace with what the Texans did. But I think they had a decent little offseason, losing probably their best production on offense in Calvin Ridley, which, sucks. But then they brought in Gabe Davis and Brian Thomas Jr. So they, at the very least, I think have 3 very solid number 2 receivers. Brian Thomas Jr., I think, could easily be one of the best rookie receivers in this class. And then Christian Kirk, Gabe Davis, 2 700-yard receivers every year. So they've got a solid receiving core. I think it's going to end up being a lot better than it was last year. A lot more well-rounded, not just leaning on Calvin Ridley and Evan Ingram and Christian Kirk every now and again. So definitely an improvement there. And then bringing in Darnell Savage and Eric Armstead, good veteran signings, guys who know what they're doing. Mitch Morse, very experienced, good offensive lineman who's gonna, be kind of the vocal guy on that line, I'm guessing, and help with all the protection calls and all that. So I think they had a pretty decent offseason.
Yeah, no, I agree. And one thing I did kind of notice when I was looking into the Jaguars is while Calvin Ridley did lead the team in receiving yards last year, Evan Ingram led in receptions by like 60 or something crazy like that.
Yeah.
So it felt like Evan Ingram was more of the number one receiving target last season, and Calvin Ridley just happened to be the guy with the most yak. So I think I agree with you that the wide receiver room should be better this year. They've got more options than just Evan Ingram and then Calvin Ridley, and then every now and then Christian Kirk gets a bone thrown his way. I think, with those three guys, along with Evan Ingram and then Trevor Lawrence, hopefully can get healthy. I think that's going to be probably the most important part to this, because they probably would have made the playoffs if it wasn't for that high ankle sprain last year. I think I'm probably going to give the Jaguars a solid. I think I'm going to give them a B+, slightly above a B. Because I do like the wide receiver talent they brought in. They made an attempt to, improve upon a defense that was really bad last season and has been for a few years now. So, I think bringing in those guys like Eric Armstead, who I forgot to mention earlier, Darnell Savage and Ronald Darby, who've, been around the block a time or two in the NFL. All three of those guys have a lot of veteran experience. Hopefully that should bring, a boost in production on that defensive side of the football. So.
Yeah, I think ultimately they need to figure out the run game and not put so much pressure on Trevor Lawrence. Last year, bottom third in the league in rushing offense. So I think to really take that next step, they need to figure that out. Which, bring in Mitch Morse, hard-nosed, gritty guy. They've already got ET in there. So, but as far as this offseason kind of grade, I think I'd probably lean a B. I mean,
yeah,
nothing super splashy outside of the draft, I don't think. Other than just some solid veteran guys that are gonna hopefully help kind of rebuild the culture there and set the tone.
Yeah, I agree. If that defense can, really improve off of last year, and that line can hold up, I think the Jaguars should be right in the mix of a wild card spot, and maybe even compete for the division with the Houston Texans. So, and moving on to our final team, the Tennessee Titans. Last season, we witnessed the end of the Ryan Tannehill, Mike Vrabel era, with the Titans choosing to move on from both their starting quarterback and head coach by season's end, pulling the trigger earlier on one than the other. We also got to see Will Levis step in to fill Tannehill's shoes in the second half of the season, where he showed promise, but inevitably wasn't able to turn Tennessee's season around, despite my hopes and prayers. I really liked Will Levis, but this season they look to build up the infrastructure around Levis while having to say goodbye to a few quite notable names. Starting off with the biggest departure this offseason, Derrick Henry ends his time as a Tennessee Titan and chooses to sign with the Baltimore Ravens. Henry has been the workhorse for that offense since his third season, when he finally took over lead back duties from DeMarco Murray and came ever so close to breaking the single season rushing record in 2020, coming just 78 yards short of the record. The Titans also losing some recognizable guys on the defensive side of the football, watching their team leader in tackles last season, linebacker Azeez Al-Shaair, and team sacks leader edge rusher Danico Autry sign with the division rival Houston Texans, as well as losing team leader in interceptions cornerback Sean Murphy-Bunting to the Arizona Cardinals. Not to mention losing interior lineman Aaron Brewer to the Miami Dolphins, who started all 17 games in both of the last two seasons. As for the key additions, Tennessee had some big holes to fill, starting off with the big trade. The Titans acquired cornerback L'Jarius Sneed from the Kansas City Chiefs in exchange for a third-round pick, before signing him to a massive 4-year, $76 million deal to be their franchise staple in the secondary for at least the next few years. As for in free agency, in an attempt to compensate for some of the production leaving with Derrick Henry, they did sign running back Tony Pollard away from the Dallas Cowboys, who looks to improve on what was kind of a meh year last season, where he did rush for 1,000 yards, but on only 4 yards a carry. Also on the offensive side of the football, bringing in center Lloyd Cushenberry to replace Aaron Brewer, and two talented receivers to add next to D-Hop in Tyler Boyd from Cincinnati and Calvin Ridley from rival Jacksonville. Both guys with multiple 1,000-yard seasons under their belt. And on defense, other than Snead, the Titans brought in fellow cornerback Chidobe Awuzie out of Cincinnati, as well as some front seven help in linebacker Kenneth Murray and D-lineman Sebastian Joseph Day. And looking into their draft, Tennessee had a bit of a preference for the big boys, taking 6'6", 340-pound offensive tackle J.C. Latham out of Alabama, 7th overall, before taking 6'5", 360-pound defensive tackle T'Vondre Sweat out of Texas, 38th. Latham should hopefully plug a massive hole on the end of the offensive line that allowed the 5th most sacks in the league last season. Meanwhile, Sweat should be a massive obstacle for any opposing teams running back to get around. After that, the Texans drafted mostly defense, notably taking linebacker Cedric Gray out of North Carolina and cornerback Jarvis Brownlee from Louisville in the 4th and 5th rounds, respectively. So, Aaron, how are we feeling about the first offseason for the Titans sans Vrabel?
This could low-key be one of the divisions that is, exciting to watch this year. Lots of competition.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe the Texans run away with it, but I think you could very easily have 3 other teams competing for the wild card.
I agree.
Sure, they lost, 3 high production guys and Alshire, Autry, and Bunting on defense, but brought in Awuzie, brought in Snead. 5 of their 7 draft picks were defense, so I think they're comfortable with where their offense is at, and know that they need to kind of tighten up that defense. No pun intended. And I think they're in a great position to do so. Love the T'Vondre Sweat pick. Probably, borderline first round pick. Obviously, ended up going 38th overall. J.C. Latham, one of the kind of physical specimens at Alabama. So they, not a lot of splash in flash. They're on the defensive side, but they brought in Calvin Ridley and Tyler Boyd, Tony Pollard for Will Levis to kind of have some weapons to get the ball to, maybe not feel as pressured as he did last year, and hopefully he takes a good step forward towards being their franchise guy next year.
Yeah, I mean, I will say this much. They're doing everything in their power to try to surround Will Levis with talent, both on the offensive side of the football to help him, take some pressure off of him in the running back game and obviously give him some more weapons to throw to, but also on the defensive side of the football to hopefully take some pressure off the offense entirely and maybe, not make them have to score as many points because, yeah, I mean, this team, they definitely feel like they're taking a step in the right direction. I like bringing in Lloyd Cushenberry to replace Aaron Brewer in the middle of that line. And then obviously J.C. Latham, if he can, be an immediate impact player like some people think he can be on the outside of the offensive line, then I think, hopefully Will Levis should have much more time this year than he had last season. That's really was probably the biggest problem with the offense last year is that we couldn't really see how much Will Levis had to offer because the dude was, getting hurried every single snap, it seemed. So hopefully bringing in those linemen can improve upon that. And then on the defensive side, like you said, drafting almost exclusively defensive players this year, specifically T'Vondre Sweat, I think was a really good move on their part, losing as many, key talented players as they did in the free agency. So I will say, I think overall they did perform better than the Colts. Probably not as good as the Jags, in my opinion, but I do think this could be a sneaky underrated offseason. So I'm between a B- and a B on this one, but I think I'm gonna go B just because I do like the two. The Tyler Boyd one probably pushed me up to a B for them.
Vrabel's not there, but this feels very much like a Vrabel team. T'Vondre Sweat. Big, physical, pull stuffer, L'Jarius Snead, very physical. Doesn't, maybe get the most picks, but he's a big physical DB. Maybe not the most physical run game anymore, but they've got those kind of speed receivers, and D-Hop, he'll catch it in traffic, and anywhere you put the ball within his wingspan, he'll catch it. So this feels like a very physical, gritty team. Love the T'Vondre Sweat pick. Love the L'Jarius Sneed acquisition. So I think I'd lean towards B plus.
Yeah, yeah. Like I said, the Tyler Boyd one really pushed me up to a B, but I was on a fence before that even. So I do think they did really well this offseason. And this whole division should be fairly competitive, I think. All four, well, obviously the Texans should be, in theory could run away with the division. Hopefully they don't. Hopefully it's competitive. But as far as the entire contention picture goes, the Texans should be right up there with anybody else in the AFC. I think the Titans could be sneaky. The Jags should be good. The Jags should be a playoff team this year. The Titans could sneak in maybe, depending on how much Will Levis grows. And then kind of the same with the Colts. The Colts could sneak into that conversation too if Anthony Richardson takes a massive step this season. So I'm really excited to see how this AFC South shakes out this year after being the laughing stock of the AFC as far as divisions go for quite some time. It's a real breath of fresh air to see all four of these teams making substantial moves to try to improve their respective rosters. So unless you got anything else, Aaron, I think that'll do it for this episode of the most unprofessional sports channel on YouTube, Swivel Chair Sports. I've been your host, Zach Circleberg Burkle, here at the coast today. Aaron, go and say bye, Aaron.
Bye.
All right. Once again, I just want to thank you all for watching. We've received tons of views, likes, subscriptions throughout the past couple weeks. So just really wanted to stop and thank you guys for watching and subscribing. And to anybody who's new since, last time they subscribed, thank you for subscribing. Hello. But other than that, yeah, make sure to like, subscribe, send it to a friend if you haven't. Other than that, deuces. Have a good day.